Don't touch that dial. You're tuned in to the Dread Podcast Network.
Welcome to Development Hell. For every horror movie that hits VOD, countless others end up DOA. Development Hell is the podcast dedicated to unearthing these cursed horror productions. We're going to find out what went wrong, and then decide if these titles still stand a shot at the green light. I am your host, Josh Korngut. I am the managing editor of Dread Central. I am also a filmmaker in Toronto, Canada. This podcast is a proud member of the Dread Podcast Network. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Development Hell. Today is the final episode of our 5-part miniseries, Halloween is Canceled. Today, we're going to take an inside baseball look at all things Halloween Ressurection, Dimension Films. Today, we're joined by a very special guest, former Dimension Films executive, Louis Spiegler. Yeah. Louis, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing good. Thank you for joining me today. I was wondering, could you introduce yourself to the Dread Central audience?
Sure. My name is Louis Spiegler. I am an independent producer, writer, and recovered Miramax Dimension executive.
Hey, I'm very happy to hear that. So I was wondering, first things first, how did you get your start in Hollywood?
I got my start as an assistant. I was working at ICM, International Creative Management, which is now owned by CAA. But back in the day, they were one of the big 3 or big 4. And I was in New York working I started in the mailroom, which was, that's where you begin when you're in the agent training program. And then landed on a desk. And at the time I was working there, it was because I was in New York, that it almost felt like there was this feeding line, that connected ICM to Miramax. And so people were gradually making their way out of ICM, mostly assistants. Were ending up at Miramax working as assistants in other departments. And there was a guy who had worked at ICM who I had kept in close contact with. And he one day told me there was this opening to be an assistant. And, can you fax, just to date myself even further, he said, can you fax over your resume? Which I did. And, in short order, I was interviewing with the assistant who I was going to be second in command to. And after passing muster with him, I came in to meet with the big guy who I was going to be co-assisting. And that was my foray, and that was how I ended up at the Dimension side of Miramax.
Can I ask who that head in charge was at the time?
Yes, that was Bob Weinstein.
Okay, very interesting.
Yes.
What was that like at the time? Like, were you familiar with this person as an entity?
I was. I was familiar. I mean, this was like the end of the 90s in New York, and Miramax was one of the they were sort of one of the top. Certainly, they were one of the top places in New York. I mean, it was really Miramax and New Line, I would say, were the dominant players, with October Films, which sort of went through a couple of name changes before becoming Focus. And then there was Scott Rudin, who was legendary, notorious, however you want to put it. But he had a major presence in New York. But really, Miramax seemed to be the place with New Line tied, I would say, maybe running a close second, in terms of being places that if you wanted to work in the film business but wanted to do it out of New York, that was where you were. That was the game.
Were you nervous at all having to work with such big personalities? Like, was there anything going in that you sort of, could have been nervous about?
No, because, just to put things into sort of the proper context, I had been working as an assistant to a pretty demanding agent at ICM, a woman named Elaine Goldsmith Thomas, who was tough but fair, but the hours were crazy. And tempers were constantly flaring at ICM between everyone, because that was just sort of the culture at ICM. And then I had been dealing on a regular basis with, the assistants that worked with Scott Rudin, and to an extent, the assistants and, the people that were working with Harvey. So assistants in that time, we all kind of got to know one another. And so stories were always being shared. And, there were really no surprises. Anybody who came into work for one of the big agents in New York, or anybody who was going to work for Scott Rudin, knew, like with Scott, you just knew, all right, the hours are insane. He covers theater and film. You're expected to be in the office at 7 a.m. if you're the new guy, and you're not expected to roll out of there until 10, and you're on call and all that craziness. And Bob and Harvey had a similar reputation. I would say Harvey in particular had the reputation for crazy hours, and a team of 3 or 4 assistants. And he was, constantly on the move, constantly flying to and from LA or film sets, and, needed basically, was like traveling with the president. Whenever he went somewhere, he traveled with at least one person. Bob, on the other hand, was a lot more mercurial and was much more focused on the business of making movies and the business of running the company. And, he liked to keep a low profile. Where Harvey thrived in the spotlight, Bob would shrink into the background, and, at any premiere or whatever event that they were at, he might be the last to arrive and the first to leave. That was sort of his MO. I wouldn't put him, excuse me, I wouldn't necessarily put him at the same, how would I describe it? I wouldn't exactly say he was Logan Roy from Succession, but, if you can imagine that sort of moodiness and like, all right, I'm out of here, that was Bob.
Yeah. Now, of course, a lot came out in 2017 with the Me Too movement. Were you shocked by all of that, or is that something that took you and your peers by surprise?
I think we were initially, a lot of us, taken by surprise, only because, I think the people who worked at the company, there were like different layers, different tranches, I guess is how I would put it. But the people who sort of spent enough time in that sort of orbit just generally had a sense of like, oh, Harvey's a player, Harvey, there was like this unspoken, like, oh, we all sort of knew that he was sort of in that old school Hollywood, mode of like, he's married, but or whatever, we knew that he was, yeah. So I think when the story that everybody, not everybody, I shouldn't say that, a lot of people at the company were sort of expecting to break at some point was just infidelity, all of that. So I think when the actual story broke, there was a lot. I know there were a lot of phone calls back and forth between everybody. Holy shit, what? Wait, this is a next level, and then I think what happened over in a pretty quick succession, especially once it became apparent that that they were releasing, everybody from their NDAs, and people no longer had that fear of lawsuit, for saying anything. That's when you started to get to hear more and more what certain people either really knew or suspected, and then it also became very clear like why they weren't talking about it, just because as you started hearing more and more, about the kind of lawsuits, but also if you worked there and you saw the level of attorneys that those guys could retain, and just for regular business dealings, I think that'll do it. When if you saw the way they handled legitimate business and the how aggressive they were when it came to negotiating deals and contracts, and how they expected lawyers at the company to handle things when they thought that something had been breached, or they just wanted to be super aggressive about making somebody, bend to their will. You would think twice before putting yourself in potential legal jeopardy, because you just knew that even if you were right, like they had the power of the purse and A-level attorneys who could make things very unpleasant but also very expensive. And so I think a lot of people, before the story broke and before they knew they could talk about what they knew, were reluctant. And the way I would sort of characterize it was, I think a lot of people assumed that other people knew the same things, but because those people didn't feel comfortable talking about those things, I think it came as a surprise to the people who knew how many people didn't, because I think there was like it was kind of like that weird it was like if you knew somebody else knew the other piece of the puzzle, you were maybe comfortable talking to them about it, but you didn't want to be the first person to open your mouth and then have the other person go, "Oh, I don't know. Wait, who was that? Who is that you're talking about?" And then you were like, "Oh shit."
Now you were saying like everything broke out, and in retrospect, seeing things like more lawyers than necessary being brought into casual situations, like did it repaint any of your experiences, sort of knowing what you know now and reflecting on what you saw?
Well, at Dimension, it was a different story. It was really, we were not in the same swimming in the same water necessarily as there was overlap for sure. I mean, in terms of executives, we would deal with one another on both sides of the company, but even the way that Bob and Harvey ran the company, there was like this weird thing where the brothers each, I think, respected that they each had their own staff. And so, Harvey might sometimes bark at a Dimension executive and ask for something, but like he also didn't dare, threaten to fire someone who worked for Dimension, and vice versa. Bob would. I remember seeing Bob get really annoyed at Miramax executives not knowing the answers to something that he wanted, asked in the middle of a production meeting that he would attend. But he also knew that like all he could do was sort of smirk and growl at them, but that unless his brother decided, oh, well, I'm going to now, shit can that person because of something Bob said, it didn't have any weight. And in fact, they were at times just competitive enough with one another that, if it's almost like if one or the other got angry at a member of the other brother's team, it was almost like the other brother would then step to protect that person, just to be like, don't you tell me how to run my
Ship.
my ship. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So
Fascinating.
yeah, that's sort of how I would. I mean, it was a dysfunctional family.
I mean, listen, I'm sure we could do a whole mini series on the dramas behind the scenes at the studio. But for me personally, what I'm most interested in, Dimension Films in the 90s was the place to be for horror. They owned a couple of the most important franchises at the time. You guys had Scream, Halloween, Prophecy, Dracula, Children of the Corn. Before we get into your journey with Halloween, what were some of the other horror properties that you worked on?
Well, the ones that I mostly worked on directly were Halloween, Children of the Corn, the first Dracula 2000. But then, when I was on Bob's desk, we had anything that was in production or, in development and going to go into production. I was, part of my job was to keep up with the drafts of scripts and write up my own notes. Bob would read my notes, and then, if there was stuff that he thought was relevant or that he really agreed with, he'd bring it up to the filmmakers. Sometimes he would reference me directly when he would bring them up, but sometimes it was just my job to sort of, it was like being it's like almost like being a law clerk, to like a Supreme Court justice. You knew that, he might just, your job was to do a lot of research for him as well. So, starting with, I think when I was there, starting with things like Mimic and The Faculty and, whatchamacallit, I'm trying to think of the big ones. Mimic, The Faculty, like Halloween H2O, First Spy Kids.
Cool.
I was, part of my job was just, keeping up with the development process on those movies and, weighing in. There was a movie, Phantoms.
Oh, yeah.
That was being made simultaneously as the first Mimic. And so there was constantly like, and I think they were both shooting in Canada. I want to say Mimic was in Toronto. I can't remember if Phantoms was in Toronto or Calgary. But they were in production simultaneously. And I think there was
From Dusk Till Dawn movies, I think, were there too.
Those were done. The sequels were done direct to video, and those I think shot in South Africa.
Cool. I remember those. The scary movies, some Crow sequels, tons and tons.
Yeah, the Crow ones were. It seemed like those happened more off radar. I think we can get into this. There were some parallels in terms of Halloween in that the Crow franchise, I believe the rights were controlled by producer Edward Pressman. And so I think there was always this sort of one of those tug of wars over, who ultimately had creative final say. And I think Ed Pressman had some veto power because he actually, was one of those situations where he owned the rights and they were like the deal was for Dimension to to finance and produce and distribute the movies, but the rights were retained by Pressman.
I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that could lead us into Halloween, because Halloween was also in the hands of sort of two very distinct entities. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Wait, and I'm curious, I'll quiz you. Which two are you referring to?
I'm referring to Dimension Films and Trancas Entertainment.
Yes, Trancas International, which
yes.
was Mustafa
Mustafa
Akkad's
Akkad, yeah.
company. Yeah, and that was one of the, again, that was a similar situation where, where Trancas controlled the rights to Halloween, to the Michael Myers character. And the deal that they struck was for Dimension to finance and distribute those films. And then I think Dimension would own the right to the film itself, but the character still belonged to Trancas, and the deal was that all creative decisions had to be mutually agreed upon. And so what that meant was that, if Trancas genuinely objected to something that Dimension wanted to do, they could just gum up the works and say, we're not going to sign off on that. And so, it rarely came to blows, but it was definitely, a thing where we had to kind of, do a dance with them and, really, just make them comfortable with certain decisions. But at the same time, if they wanted to absolutely just kill something, they could do it. And, I certainly think that they flexed their control when it came to scripts and like what they would say yes to versus, I think in the general rule was, if it felt like it was a script that had the potential to kill the franchise, kill Michael permanently, that was usually like a no-no.
Well, how did they get away with H2O, I wonder? Because
I think with H2O, I think what it was, it's funny, I don't actually remember them expressing any objection to Laurie chopping his head off. I think primarily because it just played so well with an audience. And the sense I got was, if the movie does really well, we'll just figure out a way to kind of, reboot it.
Yeah, and they did.
That was always the, like, if there was like an outside, if there was, no matter how ridiculous, if there was a way that you could pull it off, they were fine with, the badass ending that left the audience thinking, oh, there's going to be no more Michael Myers.
Do you think people like Jamie Lee Curtis and others maybe had the impression that it was going to be a bit of a finale, and maybe some of the producers knew well that that's not what was going to be?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Was there any misleading, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think Jamie, did H2O because it was a juicy role. It was it was ultimately well written on the page, and she was, excited to do it. And, there had been movies done without her. So I think she wasn't thinking, ahead to, starring in any future ones. I think, that was just my general sense, and I think that mutually, I think the attitude also was like, yeah, if we can get her back for a film and it makes sense, then we'll go for it, but if there's a way to do it without her, if it requires doing it without her, or if we come up with a killer story that doesn't require her, that's fine too,
Were you there for the development? So, like, the script development of Ressurection? Do you remember?
Oh yeah.
Like, any of the other directions that this could have gone?
The overall premise of Ressurection was never wavered. It was always going to be a, basically what you saw, a reality TV exploration of the Michael Myers house and town. And, but then things go sideways when, oh my God, he's actually shown up.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always going to be that. I think it was more.
Who came up with that? Who brought that to the table?
That was Trancas. They partnered up with this screenwriter named Larry Brand, who concocted this whole idea, and they really liked it. And I think the initial fight, because there's always a fight, was not over the general story. It was more about the writing of the script, about like, was it too cheesy? Did the characters play right? Just was the dialogue gonna just sound too clunky? Those were the real areas where Dimension dug in, and I think, rightfully so. I think the from the minute I got involved with the project, the attitude was, look, our job is to make this script as good as it can be. And, what just became very clear very early on to us was simply that, like, Larry had his limitations, and it was the what we were struggling with Trancas was basically convincing them to sign off on another screenwriter, but with making them comfortable with it, that we weren't trying to just use another screenwriter to wrestle creative control away from them. I think that was always the concern of Trancas. And, to be fair, it wasn't just them. I mean, I think there was always this, tension with almost any filmmaker that we did business with, on both sides of the company, on both Dimension and Miramax, that, you were constantly having to sort of bend the knee, so to speak, and follow the direction of what the studio wanted. And if you were lucky, the studio saw eye to eye with your creative vision if you were the writer and the director, on a movie. But if you didn't, it was just going to be a bumpy road, because the Bob and Harvey would dig their heels in more and more, because I think there was just they just came at it from a degree of mistrust, that the filmmakers were gonna not necessarily deliver something that would work properly, that they could market properly. And so there was always that tension that existed. And so it wasn't unique to the dynamic, the Trancas Dimension dynamic was not unique to that arrangement. I think there was always those kinds of levels of tension. I think the difference was, unlike other projects where if it was a spec script and Dimension bought it, or an option of the book or whatever, where they controlled the rights to whatever it was that was being made, they had an easier time, taking a project in the direction the studio wanted to take it in. Whereas with Halloween, because of that rights situation, it forced Dimension to do more of a dance with Trancas. I don't want to call it seduction, but I would say, it was making sure that, basically it was convincing them, when we really wanted to go in a particular creative direction, that it was purely because we wanted to service the franchise properly.
Right. With personalities so large, was there resentment that they had to do that?
know if resentment is the term I would use. I think it was, just sort of grudging acknowledgement that was what was required. That Mustafa required a little more hand holding. He had to make sure that he knew he was being respected. And if you could do that, then he was pretty good about signing off on creative decisions. And I got along very well with Mustafa and his son Malik, and they had a producer that they worked with on Ressurection and I think on H2O, a guy named Paul Freeman, who was their guy. And so again, it was the standard, dynamic where you just made sure that you were respecting, that they felt and knew they were being heard and respected, and they were then more open to doing things, so long as they felt that they were being properly consulted, and that if they had a genuine objection, they knew that their objections, they had the veto power. It was, and so it was just a dance, and we, and I was responsible for doing it, and and I got to know them pretty well, and I got to understand how to do it.
Mm-hmm. When production began, what was your role? Like, what were you up to on a day-to-day basis once things were rolling?
I was on set, and my job before going on set and while being on set was, just making sure that there were no surprises, making sure that we knew as a studio what was being shot, what the sets were, making sure that the pages that we were shooting were the pages that everybody had mutually signed off on. And then it was just little things like, literally just being on set and, making sure that, to my satisfaction at least, we were getting enough coverage that we wouldn't be stuck if there was, something that wasn't necessarily working in post-production. And so that, there was a fair amount of that. And that was probably less to do with that kind of tension had less to do with Trancas versus Dimension, and it was more about just making sure that the director Rick Rosenthal both had everything that he needed to get shots, but also that occasionally I was pushing him to do the things that I knew the studio would want, even if we both agreed, oh my God, this, like, no, we're not going to edit the scene that way. There was a lot of like, look, if you can give the appearance of respecting that Bob is going to try and weigh in with his own opinions and see that he has choices, then he's more likely to go with your creative choice. That was sort of my role, really, as and of course I was, basically in I would never call it a no-win situation, but like, to the filmmakers at Trancas, they would sometimes look at me as, oh, you're the spy who's constantly, going to report in when we're doing something that's, that you don't approve. And the reality was, I was, I would describe it as like, I was like the manager of a baseball team who my job was to be paranoid. My job was to constantly